Hello everyone and welcome back to Ruby Lessons in Codecademy. So in the last lesson we started looking at methods, or more accurately functions, even though Codecademy called them methods. So we looked at more simpler methods which only don't ask for any kind of input. They only give you an output when they're called. So today we're going to be looking at how we can alter what the output of them is. Well, we did look at some functions which did actually accept some input, but we didn't write any that accept input. Today we're going to be writing ones that accept input. Or parameters and arguments. If a method takes arguments which say it accepts or expects those arguments, we might define a function square like so. So define, then we have the square, so that's the name, and n, where in between the parentheses we have a variable, which is the input expected, or what the input that is given to it is going to be named. So if you give it an input of 2, n is going to be equal to 2, and puts n times 2, n squared, is going to give out 4. And you can call it like this, so if you have 12, then it's going to return 144, or puts 144. Because 12 squared is 144. So the argument is the piece of code you actually put between the method's parentheses when you call it, and the parameter is the name you put between the method's parentheses when you define it. So this is the argument, and the parameter is this. So the argument in this case is going to be 12, and the parameter is going to be n, because we're defining it as n, and calling the argument of 12. So for instance, when we defined square above, we gave it the parameter of n for number, but passed it the argument 12 when we called it. As I said, I didn't actually even see that bit of text there. Oh well. You can think of parameters as nicknames for the method definition gives to an argument, since it doesn't know ahead of time exactly what the argument is going to get. So it's just like if you have my int is a nickname for 5. It's just the same here, but because you're passing it, it can be anything in this case. Here you kind of know what it is going to be, but even if you might not know what it is, because you can have it equals 9, and then n, it goes through a list of numbers and becomes every number in turn, and then the number that it stops at becomes my int as well. So something like that. But let's not get too complicated here. You can think of parameters, okay, we saw that. Parentheses are usually optional in Ruby, but it's a good idea to put your parameters and arguments in parentheses for readability. And I'm definitely going to be doing that because I'm used to it from other programming languages. So I guess you don't really have to put those parentheses there, but even if you don't put them, you have to put a space here, otherwise the function is going to be called square n. And you're going to confuse Ruby of what's happening. So our instructions: call the Cupertino method in the editor, passing it an argument of 8. I swear that's supposed to be cube root. Why is it timesing it by 3? That's weird. Oh well, let's see. So cube root INO, passing it an argument of 8. So if it was cube root, it should return 2. But it seems to be cubing it. So that's what? Going to return 512? Yeah. So is it going to ask us to fix it? Hopefully. Let's see. Oh, maybe not. So let's actually fix it just for our sake. So if you wanted to fix it, to the power of 3, you reverse it by doing cube root. Cube root is the same as to the power of a third. And if we do that, oh, okay. It looks like you didn't print the value of 8 to the console. It returns 1. Okay. So if you wanted to do cube root, then this is what you would do. So why it wasn't working was because we were using integers. So if you're using integers, 1 divided by 3 is going to be rounded down to 0, because integers are always rounded down. Even if you had 1.9, and if you did integer of 1.9, that would give you the value of 1. And 1 divided by 3 is going to be 0. 8 to the power of 0 is 1, because any number to the power of 0 is going to give you 1. So I think that we don't actually need to have that as point 0 either. So if you want a function that gives you the cube root of a number, you can do something like this. So cube root n times 1.0 divided by 3.0, because this is going to give you a not an integer but a float or a double, or what, I'm not sure what it is in Ruby by default. It's normally a float, I believe. So 1.0 divided by 3.0 is going to give you 0.3 recurring. And that's why this actually works and returns a value of 2.0. If you don't have the decimal places, then Ruby assumes that you're giving it integers, which is why it returns a 1 here. But let's return it to what it wanted us to do, even though it's called cube root. I don't know what the INO stands for, so maybe that's something to do with it. But yeah, there we go, 512 if you do what Ruby asks you to do. Moving on then. Splat. So speaking of not knowing what to expect, your methods not only don't know what arguments they're going to get ahead of time, but occasionally they don't even know how many arguments there will be. So let's see how we deal with that. Let's say you have a method, friend, that puts the argument it receives from the user. It might look something like this. So you have defined friend name. Puts my friend is name full stop. But you are going to have multiple friends, and those friends are going to have different names to other people's friends. So it doesn't know what name is going to be or how many friends to expect. So the solution to how to deal with this is using splat arguments. Splat arguments are arguments preceded by an asterisk, which signals to Ruby, hey Ruby, I don't know how many arguments there are about to be, but it could be more than one. But there's definitely going to be one. If there isn't one, then you're going to get an error. Instructions. Click Save and Submit code to test out the example in the editor. Feel free to play around and call what up on as many bros as you like. Okay. So in other programming languages, I don't think that this exists, so you have to use a list. So if you don't want to use splat arguments, then you can just use a list as an input. And that's also going to work fine, because a list can contain as many values as you want, with whatever you want them to be. So let's see how this works. So we have define, what up, greeting, and bros. So we can have as many bros as we want, or where the minimum is one bro. I'm guessing like a friend or whatever. Then we have bros.each, so we're going through bros. And bro puts greeting, so whatever the greeting is. So we are passing the greeting, what up, and then to all of these guys. So that's what happens. So if you wanted to add something more, then you can have like this. So you can just put that. So you also notice that the asterisk argument is put as last. If you put it as before the greeting, then you're going to confuse it. You might actually confuse it. I'm not sure, because okay, let me test this out. So it doesn't actually get confused. It counts the very last input as the greeting. That's quite interesting. But then if you put another one here, another input here, then in this case it is going to be confused. Yeah, because like this, it's expecting any number of inputs here, then just one input, and then any number of inputs here, but it doesn't know where the greeting is, which is why that happens. So let's return it to what it was in the beginning. And there we go. So you can have it, if there are only two arguments, you can have them either way around, as long as you make sure that the thing that you want to be the greeting, in this case, goes at the end, if greeting is at the end. If you want to have multiple splat arguments, then I don't think that that's actually possible. So how you would go around doing that is maybe passing lists, as I mentioned before, because in lists you can definitely know you're just passing two lists, and those lists get a separate name each, and then you can just use them to do pretty much the same thing. Let's submit code and move on. So let's learn return. I did kind of mention this in the very first lesson for the methods. So sometimes we don't just want a method to print something to the console or put something to the console, but we actually want that method to hand us, or another method, back a value. For that we use return. So sometimes you don't want a visual output, sometimes you want an output from a method that's used in the rest of the code to return you the ultimate, if you want, output. Because you don't really have to see what that returns. You don't care what that one method returns, as long as what the ultimate result is what you want. So let's see how return works. So this is our function. We have define double n. So and then it returns, notice return, it doesn't print or puts n times 2. So this function on its, or method on its own, isn't going to do anything unless called. And even when called, it's not going to show any output to the console. So in the example above, we define a new method called double that accepts one argument called n, number. Inside the method, we return 2 times n. So what you would also probably want to do is check that n is a number. After that, we call our new double method with an argument of 6 and store that result 12 in output. So output equals double 6. So double 6 is calling double with n equals 6. And we're storing it as output. We still haven't shown anything on the screen or on the console. Then we do output plus equals 2, so adds 2 onto the value that it got from double. So that's going to be 14. And then it puts output. So that's going to be 14 that we see on the screen. We're never going to see 12 out. So, oh, okay. I just wanted to show this. I thought it was going to be here. So as you can see, all we see is 14. We never see the 12 come up, because all we did is return 2, n times 2, and that doesn't get printed out. So let's follow the instructions and see what we need to build. Define a new method called add, so let's just comment this or delete it out, why not? Def add, that takes 2 numbers as arguments. JK. Okay. Inside the method, return the sum of those 2 numbers. So return j plus k. End. Okay, we have done that. We are not going to see anything to the console, because we're not doing puts here. We're doing return, and we also never actually call the function. So this function is useless. It does nothing so far. Practice makes perfect. So if you wanted to make that function do something, then first of all you would have to call it, and then if you wanted to see what it outputs, then you would have to puts add that number and that number. And now it puts it out. If all you did was that, then you're not going to see anything either. Well, you see it now because of how Codecademy is behaving, but that's instead of the nil that would appear. You wouldn't see anything if this was an actual Ruby compiler. Okay, moving on. Practice makes perfect, so you won't become a master method maker till you make a mess of methods. Okay, no, I'm not going to say it 3 times as fast. You can try that at home. Define by 5. So we have a method called by 5. So the example above is just a reminder on how to define a method. So we have define by 5 question mark n. Return n evenly divisible by 5 equals 0. So this is going to return a Boolean value. Just a reminder, a Boolean value is a true or a false value. So if n is evenly divisible by 5, then it's going to return true. If it isn't, it's going to return false. That's all that this is going to be doing. Instructions: define two methods in the editor. Define a greeter that takes a single string parameter, name. Let's do the end. I have a feeling I'm just going to forget it otherwise. And returns a string, so returns a string parameter, name. I don't know. Returns. Make sure to use return and don't use print or puts. The string greeting. Oh, okay. So we can have something like hello there. Then we can do plus name plus full stop. And then we also need to make a function. Another one. By 3. So normally, as we've mentioned before in convention, if a method has a question mark, it returns a true or a false, which is why there's a question mark here. Don't let that confuse you. It doesn't do what an exclamation mark would do. That takes a single integer parameter, again number. Okay. I'm going to write that at the end. And returns true if that number is evenly divisible by 3 and false if not. So return n modulo 3 equals 0. I can actually get rid of that one space. I just leave it there because I find it easier to type. Oh, didn't by 3. I did define it. Does it just want to do it like that, or did I misspell it or something? This is weird. My mistake was that I used n here instead of number, but of course that's ridiculous because I never defined the parameter as n. I defined it as a number. So if you do this, everything works fine. Also, notice that you can do this in one line instead of how many people might do it in multiple lines. So what other people might do is if number, so you can do this, if that, then return true, else return false. So something like that. You can do it like this, or you can just do it in one line. So I'd recommend doing it in one line, of course, because it's much more efficient to do it in just one line. As even the example shows here. I was just looking at the Q&A forums, and it just struck me. So I looked at this here, and just looking at this, why there's no point in doing this. You don't have to do all of this code. You can just do one line and does the exact same thing. Just something that you might want to consider when doing programming. You don't want to write out loads of code. You just want to write out the least amount of code to do the same thing. Think about efficiency as much as you can, but if you find a way that works, then stick to it for a while. But then if you think of it a more efficient way, then use that instead. That's just something I wanted to add. So that's the end of today's lesson. If you didn't enjoy this video, then please give me a dislike, tell me how I can improve, but if you did enjoy it, please like, share and subscribe. It encourages me to make more videos like these. And until next time, thank you so much for watching and goodbye.